Okay, so we now move on to biomechanics, and I'd like to invite Neil Reeves to come and speak to us. Neil is Professor of Musculoskeletal Biomechanics and Head of Research at the Faculty of Science and Engineering in Manchester at the Manchester Metropolitan University. His research is into clinical movement and gait, and more recently into prevention of diabetic foot ulceration by devices such as in-shoe pressure monitoring. Neil.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And firstly, thank you to the chairman for the kind invitation to present here. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about biomechanics of the diabetic foot and lower limb. Specifically, I'm going to talk about two aspects, really. So the first is about diabetic foot ulcer prevention, and within this, I'm going to talk about some smart pressure sensing insoles for their potential efficacy for reducing diabetic foot incidence. And secondly, I'm going to talk about sedentary time as a potential independent predictor of diabetic foot ulcer development. In the second part, I'll talk about unsteadiness, balance problems, and falls, show you how this relates to the diabetic foot, also show you some interventions in terms of balance and reduced falls risk. And finally, just show you another smart insole sensor, this time geared towards improving balance and reducing fall risk. So the risk factors for diabetic foot ulcers are multiple. And so these are neuropathic diabetic foot ulcers, and particularly important is diabetic peripheral neuropathy, as it limits the perception of pain and sensory feedback. But ultimately, all these factors listed here and others culminate in the development of high foot pressures. And it's these high foot pressures that are associated with an elevated diabetic foot ulcer risk. And it's been shown from multiple studies that there is an association between high foot pressures and increased foot ulcer risk. However, all of these studies have been performed in the lab. They're confined to the lab, and they provide just a snapshot, really, so just a 1 point in time measurement. And so it's probably because of this that they have relatively limited predictive capacity in terms of who will go on to develop a diabetic foot ulcer. And we summarized many of these issues recently in a review paper that we published on this. So, as I mentioned, the research on foot pressures to date provide just a snapshot, really, just a single point in time, and they only look at walking. So there is the question of, well, is it just walking that facilitates the development of a diabetic foot ulcer, or are there other factors, or there are other activities? So that's highly likely. And there's this paper, for example, by the next speaker, Bijan Najafi and colleagues, that shows that patients at risk for a diabetic foot ulcer with diabetic neuropathy spend up to 3 times as long standing as they do walking on a daily routine. So could it be that foot loading during standing and other daily activities is also important? So, as I mentioned, what we know from foot pressure research at the moment is just a snapshot in time. It's confined to walking, it's confined to the lab, and people don't develop a diabetic foot ulcer in the lab. They develop a foot ulcer in the real world when they're doing all kinds of things that we probably can't measure in the lab. So we need to move this outside the lab and try and quantify and measure pressure in the real world, also from a point of view of understanding, but from a point of view of diabetic foot ulcer prevention. So there is the concept of using pressure feedback, again in the lab, but this has shown some efficacy. So essentially you show the patient the foot pressures that they're developing, and they can then adapt and reduce those foot pressures, albeit in the lab. And there is some lasting potential for that. It does remain, albeit for a very short period of time. So some concept, nevertheless, to show that this might work. So I'm going to show you some work that we've done recently looking at the concept of using foot pressure feedback, but during daily life for a prolonged period of time. So we investigated the efficacy of some smart pressure sensing insoles for reducing diabetic foot ulcer incidence. And this was in high-risk patients. So we published this recently in the Lancet Digital Health. So this was a proof of concept, a prospective proof of concept, randomized clinical control trial. And this was measuring and feeding back foot pressures on a daily basis over a prolonged period of time. So we looked at patients that were high risk of diabetic foot ulcer. So they all had a previous history of diabetic foot ulceration, all had neuropathy but were ambulatory. People who had an active foot ulcer at the time of inclusion were excluded, and we also excluded severe vascular disease. So as I mentioned, this was a randomized, single-blinded control trial. Initially, 90 were consented to the study and were followed up for a period of up to 18 months or until they developed a diabetic foot ulcer. So there were two groups, so an intervention group and a control group. Both groups had exactly what you see here in the picture. So this was a thin insole sensor that went into the shoe, under the foot, pod connected to the top of the shoe, and then this connected wirelessly to a smartwatch that they wore. So both groups got exactly the same, and we're able to measure the pressure that they produce on a daily basis. But the important difference is only the intervention group received the feedback to the watch. So the control group was a sham in that sense. We were able to capture the information, but they didn't get any feedback. So only the intervention group received the feedback on foot pressures. So there were 8 discrete sensors in these insoles, and you can see where they're positioned here. But for simplicity to the patient, this is the image on the right that they saw on the watch, and this was divided into 4 areas. So if there was sustained high pressure on any of those sensors, any of those areas, it would show red on the image for the patient and also provide an alarm on the watch as well. So in the intervention group, if they did receive a high pressure alert, this feedback, they were asked to follow 3 very simple steps. So walk around for 2 minutes, and that's because it could be because they're standing for a prolonged period of time. Then actively take the weight off the foot, and then finally, if the pressure still isn't reducing, remove the shoe and check for any foreign bodies. So these were the results. This is what we found from the study. So the primary outcome was ulcer incidence. And in the control group, we found 10 ulcers from just under 9,000 person days. And in the intervention group, we found 4 ulcers from just under 12,000 person days. So with the Poisson's regression analysis, we compared the number of ulcers between the groups, taking into account the exposure time. And we found a 71% reduction in the risk of reulceration. So I say reulceration because all these patients have had a previous foot ulcer. So a 71% reduction in the risk of reulceration in the intervention group compared to the control group. So at the top here, you can see that the average wear time, so we could measure this from the data, the average wear time for both groups was over 6 hours a day, but there was some variation in this, and you can see that in the confidence intervals. So we re-performed the analysis for compliers or good compliers only and defined that as being over 4.5 hours a day. And with this analysis, we then found that in the control group, there was 10 ulcers from just over 6,000 person days. And in the intervention group, there was 2 ulcers from just over 9,000 person days. So this reanalysis for compliers only led to an 86% reduction in the risk of reulceration in the intervention compared to the control group. So I think this proof of concept study shows the principle that we can measure, well, first of all, that we can measure pressure on a daily basis, and we can use that to feed that information back to the patient, and using that information, the patient can offload the foot and reduce the risk of diabetic foot ulcer incidence. So this is data from the same study. This is data from the PhD student from the PhD thesis of Katie Chatwin. So this is unpublished data that we're currently looking at. And so this shows the pressure data over that 18-month period in the 2 groups. So this is pressure data measured every minute of the day that the patient was wearing it for all the patients in the study in both groups. So a huge, huge volume of pressure data, probably something that we haven't seen before. So on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, is the high-pressure bouts, and I'll explain this in a minute. And on the x-axis is the time in study over the 18 months. And then the control group is the black line on the top. On the bottom is the intervention group. So a bout of pressure, we defined as an instance. So if you had 10 high-pressure, if we measured 10 high-pressure readings, and then the pressure dropped down, that would be one bout of high pressure. So a bout is a series of high pressure readings. So what we found was that there was a significant reduction in the number of high pressure bouts in the intervention group compared to the controls. And we might not, the reason I'm showing this is we might not have expected that, because what patients were doing is they were seeing the pressure and they were then offloading it in response to seeing the pressure. So we wouldn't have expected, we would expect to see the instances or the total duration of high pressure reduce, and we've seen evidence for that, but we wouldn't expect to see the number of bouts, because we'd still get the pressure occurring, and then when they see the pressure, they can offload it. So by finding this, we show that people are learning which activities were generating high pressures on the feet. And this happened after about 12, 16 weeks. They seemed to start to learn which activities were causing these high pressures and preempted it by offloading before it actually happened. So this was quite interesting. Also part of the same study, and again part of Katie Chatwin's PhD, in a subsample of those patients, we were able to measure physical activity in quite a lot of detail using activity monitors, and also in a reference control group of people without diabetes. So we measured for over the period of a month, and were able to categorize their activity status. And what we found most significantly, or most meaningfully, was a significant increase in the proportion of time that they spent in sedentary activities. So 66% compared to 55% in the controls. This compares well with Bijan Najafi's data that I showed earlier. They found 80% sedentary time in a similar patient cohort, but they only measured for 2 days. So it might explain some of the difference. So this is a different study, but again on sedentary behaviour, and this is a study we published this year actually, and a different study, but this was an 8-year follow-up where we showed that sedentary time was actually the strongest and an independent predictor of diabetic foot ulcer development. So an 8-year longitudinal study with 175 patients. And this was part of the Samba study. So if you look at the diagram on the left, in this study overall, there was over 500 patients. In this particular study, there were just under 200 patients included who met the criteria of having significant neuropathy, so VPT over 25, and also met the criteria of not having any history of diabetic foot ulcers, or indeed an active ulcer at the time of inclusion. So no history of diabetic foot ulcers, but significant neuropathy. They were then followed over the 8 years with measurements every year, and 62 developed a diabetic foot ulcer over this period, and 113 didn't. So what emerged was that sedentary time was the strongest and an independent predictor, taking into account these covariates, of the development of a diabetic foot ulcer over this period. Interestingly as well, what we found was that patients who developed a diabetic foot ulcer spent just over 12 hours a day in sedentary activity, sedentary time, whereas those who didn't develop a diabetic foot ulcer were sedentary for less than 9 hours a day. So I think this is probably an emerging area really in showing the importance of sedentary time in the development of diabetic foot ulcers. And the reason or the mechanism that we think relates to the physical stress theory. So with being sedentary, people are not mechanically loading their foot tissues, and we need to load tissue so that it adapts and becomes stronger. And so essentially the foot tissues are not adapting, and so in that sense, when they are loaded, and they will be loaded through ambulation, they're not as, the mechanical properties are not as high, so it breaks down. In line with this, different, but in line with this, the American Diabetes Association suggests that actually walking, weight-bearing activity shouldn't necessarily lead to an increased risk of diabetic foot ulcers. And this is based on 2 studies. And it also suggests that people should reduce sedentary time, albeit not for the reason of diabetic foot ulcer prevention. So moving on to the second part, looking at unsteadiness and balance problems and falls. So the falls are multifactorial, but particularly in this population where the risk of falling is 20-fold higher than the age-matched controls, there's two main factors that are important. So absent sensory feedback and also motor impairment due to diabetic peripheral neuropathy. And these result in altered gait biomechanics, balance impairments, and a higher risk of falls. And it also feeds back to curtail physical activity because people feel unsteady. So in a recent study, we asked people how unsteady they feel, and people with diabetic neuropathy indeed feel significantly more unsteady compared to their counterparts without neuropathy and compared to controls, so people without diabetes. And in fact, controls and people with diabetes but no neuropathy are actually fairly similar in not feeling very unsteady. So we can also measure balance and unsteadiness in the lab. These are two videos which speak for themselves, really. But these are two actual people descending the stairs. The person with diabetic neuropathy on the right is hovering their hands over the handrail, so they're not using them, but they're substantially more unsteady and also a more cautious approach to walking. So we can quantify this. So we can measure balance in the lab. The way in which we do that is by looking at the separation between the centre of pressure and the centre of mass, and particularly in the side-to-side, the medial lateral direction. And what we found actually agrees perfectly with what I showed you on perceived unsteadiness. And this is a different cohort, a different study, but it agrees perfectly with what I've just showed you. So people with diabetic neuropathy have larger values here. That means poorer balance. So they're significantly more unsteady, so significant balance impairments. People with diabetes but without neuropathy are very similar to controls. So there are alterations to gait even before the onset of neuropathy, but that's probably for another talk. But basically, diabetic neuropathy is the main factor in balance impairment and risk of falls. So interventions act upon the same two aspects that I've just described, so the sensory aspect or the motor aspect. And actually, there are very few interventions anyway, but most of them act on the motor aspect. So exercise training, so resistance exercise training for people with diabetes and diabetic neuropathy has shown, a range of studies have shown increases of up to 65% in strength. So I think this shows that even people with diabetic neuropathy still retain a marked capacity for adaptation, which is perhaps quite surprising. So these kind of studies, exercise studies, have shown efficacy for improving balance control as well, albeit a lot of exercises, a lot of tests have looked at static balance. We've also, so those are some of our studies in there, we've looked at dynamic balance, but it's mainly resistance exercise training and or balance exercise that's important in being able to cause these adaptations and improve balance. So we published a paper recently looking at addressing both, so motor and sensory aspects with combined resistance exercise and visual gaze training, because visual gaze, the way you look, is important in how you move and how you step. And so we train people with their eyes to where they should be looking as they're walking, and we tested that on an irregularly spaced stepping walkway that you see on the right. And we found an improvement in stepping accuracy. So the shortening of those bars on the left to the grey areas shows the adaptation after this 4-month intervention in the diabetes groups, and they essentially become more like a control group without diabetes that you see just above. So most interventions act on the motor system, as I've mentioned. There are some interventions that try and impact upon the sensory system by providing vibration, or also known as mechanical noise, to the foot sole. One of these studies, for example, at the bottom by Jaap van Netten's group, showed that while you're providing this mechanical noise to the plantar foot, there's a reduction in the vibration perception threshold. So in other words, an improvement in sensory perception. So a reduction in the VPT by 4 volts and an improvement in sensory perception. So that's the mechanism that's proposed to improve balance in many of these studies. Not all these studies are in diabetes patients, but there are 2 or 3 in patients with diabetic neuropathy. So this vibration is sub-perceptible, but it improves static balance. So these studies have only looked at standing balance, so postural sway during standing. So just finally, we're doing some research with some insoles that do provide vibration to the foot sole, and we're looking at the potential for them to impact upon walking. So all these previous studies that I've mentioned have used that, but are focused just on static balance, whereas walking is obviously much more challenging to dynamic balance because you've got to control your centre of mass as it's constantly changing and moving forwards. So this is just some pilot data in 15 participants to show the effects of 7 different conditions. So these numbers 1 to 7 are just different vibration conditions. And then the orange line is the control condition. And this is in terms of the variation in the centre of mass movement during walking. So the fact that all these bars are lower than this orange bar. So this orange bar is the control, a sham condition. So someone's got an insole, but it's not switched on. And all of these sensory, all these vibration conditions are sub-perceptible. So this is just some early data to show that vibration to the foot sole can improve balance during walking. So adding to the literature that you've seen showing an improvement to balance during postural static standing. So in summary, I've shown you something about the potential for smart insoles that measure pressure continuously throughout the day and feed that information back to the patient to enable them to reduce the incidence of diabetic foot ulcers. So this is by 71% or even higher by 86% if we account for good compliers. Also, I think there's an emerging body of work, and I've shown you some of that work, that looks at sedentary time as a potential independent factor in diabetic foot ulcer development. So the diabetic foot and lower limb has also got a key role to play in unsteadiness, balance problems and falls. There are interventions that act on both sensory and motor aspects, more on the motor aspects, and there's potential for some smart insoles that are geared towards improving balance and reducing falls. So thank you and welcome any questions. Thank you.